Afternoon, everyone. Let me start off as usual with just a few announcements and logistics. Tonight at 7:30, we'll be showing rounders in this room, and so you're welcome to come and sit in on that. If you'd rather watch it here, it's a really nice place to watch a movie. Reminder that we have our first poker tournament. We're going to kind of do a dry run, test the system out tomorrow night at 8 o'clock. If we already have 52 people registered, which is great, it's going to be a fun tournament. If more of you come in, what you do is you just go into the tournament section, and actually it's a little misleading. You have to say play now, even though you're not playing now, and it'll register you so that you can play. And in order to join the tournament, you just have to be logged into the PokerStars account at that time, and the table will pop up and you'll be playing. If you've never played a multi-table tournament before on PokerStars, it's kind of cool because you can see, there's a screen where you can see all the tables and all the names of the players and a leaderboard of all the chip stacks. So you can track how your friends are doing, but I recommend that you spend most of your time observing your own table when you're not in a hand. So pretty much every day we have something going on. MLK Day on Monday at 1:30, we'll have the All-In Poker movie in here. Tuesday we have our first real tournament that you're required to play in one of the satellites. So the first one is Tuesday, and the top 20 people there will win seats to playing in the live tournament. And Wednesday we have Steve Daneman, runner-up at the main event, coming to speak in class for about half of the lecture time. And we also have our second satellite on Wednesday. On Thursday we have the live tournament that night for the people that have qualified for it, and I'll send out logistics for that. And then Friday we'll have all the trophy presentations at the beginning of class and the final lecture. So that's kind of what takes us through. So let me give you this isn't working. Okay, there we go. Some observations. I've been playing every day with you guys, and it's been fun to observe. I think that the pre-flop play is much better, and I'm not just saying that, like much, much, much better. There was almost no open limping. There still was a little bit of it, but I did notice that the other players in the room would get on people's cases when they did it, so that was good. Don't open limp, but if somebody does limp, it's okay to limp. So I wasn't saying you can never limp. I'm saying don't open limp. But if somebody else doesn't follow that rule and they limp, you can limp behind them. And there's kind of the avalanche effect because every future limper gets better pot odds to continue limping. More of you are raising 3 times the previous raise, which is good. So we don't want to see like a bet to 100 and then someone raised to 200 and then someone raised to 300 because that's not actually accomplishing anything. I can say that the game has gotten a lot tougher overnight. The first day we're playing and it seemed like everybody limps and then everybody's just kind of like calling, but now it's actually tough. I'm sitting there and I put in a raise and I'm like, please don't re-raise me, please don't re-raise me. And then somebody comes in with a big re-raise and I got to fold. And so you guys are starting to make it a little harder. I also want to apologize to one of the Daniels, or both of them, because both of our course assistants have the same name, and so I thought I was getting beaten up by Lucky Daniel being Danny Blessing, but it was actually Daniel Wang, Wang. So he's Lucky Daniel, and the reason he didn't follow the naming convention is that he already had a PokerStars account. Open limping is much worse playing tournaments. So tomorrow night, many of us are going to play a tournament. I don't have the ability to drop you a letter grade if you open limp because it's pass-fail class. But I really think it's a disadvantage if you open limp. There's value to taking down the blinds in a tournament. As a tournament progresses, the small and the big blind become a significant factor. And if you raise, you have a chance of winning those with no resistance. And if you just limp, then you don't. Many of you tightened your pre-flop range, which is great. So I haven't seen as many like 4-7s and Jack Deuces as we did in the early days. And I also noticed that a lot of you are more interested in getting involved in positions. So I think you're all doing great. A few other pieces of advice. So you may have noticed that I told you guys to come in for that first raise is 300, but then I'm coming in very often for 500 or 600. And it's not like I'm teaching you not as well so that I can beat you. The problem is that at our tables, 300 isn't always doing the job. I would raise to 300 and get 5 callers. And if that's the case, then we might as well be limping, right? So the whole idea behind that 3 big blind raise is that you want to get down heads up, or you want to be up against 2 people, not against 6 people. So if you find that a raise to 300 just doesn't accomplish that, try raising to 500, try raising to 700. Just do what you need to do at that table to get 1 caller and not a whole lot of callers. So I started raising to 500 and 600. There's another piece of advice for you guys, which is that if multiple players limped in, then 300 is not enough. You need to raise 300 plus 100 for each limper that's in. So for examples, if 4 people limp into the pot and you have a hand you want to raise with, make it 700. Don't make it 300. And think about that. If 4 people have come in, they've already put 400 in the pot. 300 is not even a pot size raise. And so everybody's going to call it. And what you'll end up is 5 people will limp, the 6th person will raise to 300, and then all 5 people will put in 300. And that's not what you want when you're raising pre-flop. So account for people that are already in there. Now, if you 3-bet to 300, remember that the justification that I gave you for that is that a 3x bet is, let's say somebody raises to 300 and then you want to raise and you raise to 900. And I told you the reason is that the first 300 of that 900 is calling the bet and the other 600 is a pot size bet to match the other 600. Okay, well what happens is if you have a raise to 300 and 3 people call, your betting to 900 isn't even the pot, much less calling the bet. And so in that case, you need to raise to 1500. If you have 300, 300, 300, come in for 1500. Because what's 900 going to do? The pot odds people are getting are too high. And you want to take control when you're making a raise. So raise like you mean it. Okay. So we stopped last time with bet types. And I'm going to review. We talked about a value bet. A value bet is designed to make a worse hand call. And it's important that when you bet, you know if you're making a value bet or a bluff or a semi-bluff or one of the other bets we're going to talk about. And the reason is that you're going to size them differently based on which one of those you're making. When you make a value bet, you want to put in the smallest possible bet. I'm sorry, a value bet, you want to put in the biggest possible bet that's going to get called, right? You have a good hand, you want someone to call you. How much can you get out of them? As big as possible. When you make a bluff, you want to put in the smallest possible bet that's going to get the person to fold. Because if they re-raise you, you don't want to lose as much. On the other hand, you don't want to give away what you're doing, right? It's very straightforward if you always bet big with value and small as a bluff. And some people kind of do it the opposite. Their justification is, well, I bet real small because I wanted them to call, and I bet real big because I wanted them to fold. Well, you're betting really small when you have the best hand. That's not logical. So those factors almost even out, and I would say try to bet half the pot. That's just a really good rule of thumb. But those of you that are observing me playing in the rooms see that sometimes I bet half the pot, and sometimes I bet pot and a half, and sometimes I never bet less than half the pot, but sometimes I jack it up a little bit. And one of the reasons is that we're not ending up heads up that often. Most of the advice that I've been giving you is for when there are just 2 of you in there. But if you have more players in the hand, first of all, don't bluff as often. And that's really something important to think about. Okay? Let's say you get to the turn and there are 4 of you in the hand. Do you try to take a stab at the pot? Are you going to bluff? Well, I would say not as likely as if there's only one other person. It's kind of obvious. It's easier to get one person to fold than to get 3 people to fold. And so people's bets tend to mean more what they mean when there are a lot of people in the hand. If you end up with 5 people in the hand, someone puts in a bet, they're more likely to actually have something than if they're only up against one person. I'd like you to be able to articulate your reason for a bet. Imagine that I'm standing behind you looking over your shoulder when you're playing, and every time you make a bet, we pause the game and I say to you, explain to me why you just bet. And you should be able to say something like, I think I have the best hand and I want to get them to call. Or, I know that they have a better hand than me and I'm trying to get them to fold. Or you could say, I've got a pair and there's a draw on the board and I want to protect myself against the draw and make sure I don't give them the pot odds to call. Okay, but if you can't come up with a story that makes sense and articulate why it is that you just bet, then maybe you shouldn't be betting. Okay, there always has to be a reason. Some people, like when they first learn to play poker, they're just like, well, I'm supposed to bet. I'm an autopilot. And they just bet. But you have to have a reason, and you have to understand why you're doing it. Okay, I'm going to go through about 3 or 4 more types of bets. One of them is the pro bet. And I am not a fan of the pro bet. It is in the Harrington book, and it's one that is very, very, very common. People do it all the time. And you often will ask them, well, why did you bet there? You say, well, I didn't know where I stood. And I'm like, okay, so you're putting money in the pot and you don't know where you stand? But there is a reason sometimes to do it. It's that you can, sometimes you gain information, but I think the best reason is that when you put out a pro bet and you keep it small, you might be putting in what's actually called a blocking bet, which is you're kind of afraid if you check how much your opponent's going to bet. And they have a kind of hand where they'll call a bet, but they're not going to raise you. And so you put out a probing bet or a blocking bet out there to keep the pot a little bit smaller. Another thing that you might do is take control of the betting. So there's a concept of the betting lead. If you think about the hand pre-flop, the first person that bet now has the betting lead, and then oftentimes somebody calls, or multiple people call. Then the flop comes. The people that are in front of, out of position, compared to the person that raised pre-flop, even if they have something, they're often going to check to the raiser. Okay, or check to the better. That's an expression, is I'll check to the better. And why is, let's say I've got a super strong hand and I'm out of position, and another person raised pre-flop, the flop comes down, I'll check because they're often going to bet. And then I can raise them or I can call. But let's say I have a mediocre hand and I know that they're going to bet, and I want to bet less than they're going to bet because then they'll just call it, and that way I can keep the pot small. So that's a pro bet. Prevents the opponent from making a bigger bet. Another reason to do a pro bet would be to narrow the field. If you've got a lot of players in the hand, you want to prevent people that really shouldn't be in there from having a ridiculous hand that you never anticipated when you get later in the hand. Okay, continuation bet. This is one of the really important ones. I didn't see, watching you guys play, enough continuation bets. Obviously, I hadn't taught you guys anything about flop play yet, so I'm going to do that now. But once you get in the cash games tonight, I want to see you guys continuation bet after I tell you what it is. You raised pre-flop and you got called, so you've got the betting lead, okay? And now the flop comes, and the idea is to bet no matter what. That's called a continuation bet. So here's the thing. If it's just you and another player, 70% of the time, if one of you has 2 high cards, you will not connect with the flop. Okay? 70 is a lot. And so if you bet, the person might fold. And so sometimes you have something, and 30% of the time you're likely to have something, unless you started out with something like a very high pair. But your opponent who just called you is very unlikely to have connected with the flop. And so very often, if you just bet out half the flop, no matter what, you're just going to take it down. It's a very, very, very common play. Now, most of your opponents who are experienced know that you're going to continuation bet. They expect you to do that because you also will miss the flop 70% of the time. So this is where we kind of start getting into some head games. Continuation betting is much more effective in position because if you're in position, you got to see the person check on the flop and demonstrating some weakness. So you're the pre-flop aggressor, you've got the betting lead, and you've got position. The flop comes out, your opponent checks. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that you should pretty much bet every time in that scenario. Now, don't do it if you have more than one opponent. If you have 3 or more opponents, then it's more than 50-50 that one of them did hit the flop. And so as we get to, your bets should always be more honest the more players there are in the hand. A continuation bet is something you should really save for heads up. Now, if you c-bet a lot, which you should, you're going to get called more often when you hit the flop. And that's something that we're going to talk about. And that's actually a good thing, right? So say that you c-bet a lot. C-bet is a continuation bet. And your observant table mates notice that you're c-betting all the time. That gives you really good cover for when you actually connect very strongly with the flop. because you're going to look like you're just taking a stab at it like you always do, but in fact you really hit it. And there's a bet called the Donk Bet, and this is a real thing. We actually heard it in one of the videos yesterday. The announcer said someone donk betted. And a donk bet is when you're out of position and your opponent raised pre-flop and you called. So then the flop comes and you're the first to act and you bet. This is called a donk bet. It's named after an animal that doesn't know how to play poker. And it's an unusual way to play because, like I said earlier, if you have a strong hand and the other person has the betting lead, you're going to check to let them continuation bet because they're usually going to continuation bet. So what does it mean if you bet out? It often means that you have a weak hand. And that's how it's interpreted. But we start getting into some interesting metagame because some people, and I've even seen advanced pros donk bet, they know that everybody thinks that you're weak when you donk bet. And so they'll donk bet when they're strong. And then you can take that to an extreme, right? Once everybody knows that you donk bet when you're strong, then you can donk bet when you're weak. So you can look strong, trying to look weak, trying to look strong, trying to look weak, et cetera, et cetera. Another bet that you see a lot in poker rooms, which boggles my mind and which you cannot do online, is the blind bet. People will come out, they're the first one to act, and before the dealer deals, they'll say, I check in the dark, or I bet in the dark. And they'll bet before seeing the flop. Now, the reason that they're doing that is because they're trying to eliminate their positional disadvantage, right? Because they don't have position. So if the flop comes and then they check, you're going to interpret that they didn't hit the flop. But if they just check in the dark and then the flop comes, then it's not their turn anymore. Now it's the person in position's turn. And they're not going to know if the person hit the flop or not because they checked in the dark. It definitely makes poker easier, right? You don't have to think or do anything. You just check in the dark. But I think you're making a decision with less information than you would once you saw the flop. So I think it's a sign of weakness, and I wouldn't do it. OK, another type of bet is just a check. If you have a small value hand, and so in this case, we're thinking about a hand that you have that isn't complete garbage. You actually have some value in your hand. Maybe you have the second pair on the board or the third pair on the board. And it's unlikely that you're going to get a better hand to fold. And it's unlikely that you're going to get a worse hand to call because you got that like middling hand. And one of the things you want to do then is eliminate a street of betting, and that keeps the pot smaller. The pots grow geometrically, right? Because every time at least two people are putting in around half the pot. And so the pot is growing pretty fast. And if you have one of these middling hands, you want to get to the showdown at the river, but you don't want to get there with a really huge pot. And so you try to check through one street. Another reason to check is through trapping. So you've got an absolute monster, okay? You flop a full house or something like that. If you flop a full house, that means that the 3 cards on the board are connected to the 2 cards in your hand. And so probably nobody else has anything. It's almost impossible for anyone else to have anything. And so if you bet, everyone's just going to fold. And so you might want to check to let them catch up or to let them bluff. And so you only want to do this if you're super, super strong. And I think this is like some people get too tricky. In fact, I know people who bet whenever they're weak and they check whenever they're strong. And so they're playing absolutely inverse optimal poker. OK, so a check raise is an advanced play, but it's pretty easy to understand and pretty easy to carry out. It's a little hard to do it at the right time. So you have a pretty good hand, and you're up against a really aggressive opponent. And you know that that aggressive opponent just likes to try to steal pots. By the way, really good players will steal a lot of pots. Let me just digress for a second. So sometimes you have a situation where one of the players is really strong and the other player is really weak. The really strong player will probably win that hand. And then the roles are reversed. The other player is strong and the other one's weak. The strong will win it. And sometimes you have it where they're both strong and they're going to get it all in, and we'll see who gets lucky. But what happens when they're both weak? And that happens very often. The player who's more aggressive will usually win. And so 25% of the time, or 25% of the cases that you could have, it's really going to be the player who's more aggressive who's going to win it. If you're playing against a player like that, then you want to check raise a lot. Now, the check raise bluff is also an advanced move where you pretend that you just did that, right? You have absolutely nothing. You're up against a really aggressive player. You have a very tight table image, and you check, the player bets, and you're like, I think he's just trying to steal. I'll steal from him, and then you put in a raise. If you get check raised, you have to be really careful. Most people don't check raise bluff, and they tend to be very strong. Okay, so let me talk now about leveling. So leveling is a very, very important concept in poker. And to understand levels, we have to start at level 0. So level 0 player is someone that's unimaginative. They are not a deep thinker. They basically look at their cards, and that's the last piece of information they're going to have the rest of the hand, right? Okay, I have ace queen, and I'm going to play, I actually wrote it out. Okay, here's a level 0 thinker. I have ace queen. This is great. I'm going to bet. He just raised me. Well, I have ace queen. That's a good hand. I will call. Looks like a queen on the flop. I made a pair. I'm willing to lose all my money on this hand because I have ace queen and there's a queen on the flop. Oh, wait, what happened? How did I lose? And so this person basically is just thinking about their cards. And then the next level up from that is a better player. He knows what his cards are, but he's also thinking about what does his opponent have. And so I'll let you read this one. This is a level 1 thinker. And he's not just thinking about his cards, but he's thinking about what the opponent has. And so he can fold based on what the opponent does. Okay, so most of the average recreational players are at level 2. And they're thinking about what their cards are, what their opponents are holding, and what their opponents think that they are holding. If you can get to level 2, you're doing really well. And this is a little more advanced thinking. So you think about what you have. I have 6-7 off. I've played tight for a while. So this whole idea about I played tight is what are they thinking that I'm doing? And that's the level 2 thinking. And so you think about what you can represent and what your table image is, etc. So level 3 is the next level up, obviously. And I could give you an example of that, but it can get really, really ugly. And so the top pros basically are said to play at level 7. I can't even comprehend how that's possible or what that means. And leveling can get you in a lot of trouble because part of leveling is to think about what your opponent is doing. And so you have to assign your opponent to a level. You play for a while and you say, okay, the person in seat 3, that person is a level 2 player. And you observe that just by how they play, how they respond to people, even in live games, how they talk and how they appear to be. But what happens if you assign them level 2 thinking, but they're only doing level 1 thinking? Then you're going to misplay the hand against them. So also don't underestimate someone's ability to level you. And try to play deceptively enough that you're not giving away your level. So let me give you an example of leveling. Say that you make a big bet on the river, and your opponent thinks and thinks and thinks and thinks. And finally he says, will you show me if I fold? And this is a very common question at the poker table. We saw it in one of the videos. And typically if you say yes, it means you want him to fold, right? Because yeah, anything I can do to get you, to fold. So if you fold, I'll show you. And so then he snap calls you, calls right away. But if he knows that you know this, because everybody knows this, then he'll say yes means you want to call. But then if you know that he knows this, you'll say yes because you want him to fold and he'll think that you want him to call because he knows you and he knows that you know this and that you know that he knows that you know this. So I was trying to think of the best way to demonstrate this, and I found one, and it's not even in poker. It was in a Hollywood movie, and leveling can actually be very, very dangerous. Okay, so most of you recognize that from Princess Bride. And I just always remember that scene because of leveling, thinking about I know what you know, what I think that you think, etc. And the other lesson there is don't try to do leveling if the other guy's got the nuts or an immunity or something like that. So let's talk about the flop. We've been talking about pre-flop until now. And so we're going to look at flop strategy. Once we're on the flop, the hand is pretty much taken shape, right? Because you know 70% of the hand that you're going to have. 5 of the 7 cards have already been dealt. And you've seen several things. You've seen the pre-flop action. You've seen the action that happened on the flop in the people that are out of position. And so this street is the most critical one in terms of determining how big the pot is going to get and how many players are going to be continuing on in the hand. So many hands and on the flop, and so playing the flop correctly is important. And if you do get past the flop, then you're often going to see the river. So let's talk about what you should think about when a flop comes. So remember, we have a situation where there's been pre-flop betting, and now we have 2 or more players left. And the question is, how many players remain in the hand, and what types of players are they? What is your position relative to those players? You're going to have an advantage if you're in position, which is why you play fewer hands pre-flop out of position. Who was the pre-flop aggressor? Who was the one that raised last and the other people called? We also want to not forget to look at the pot sizes and the remaining effective stacks, and also we're going to use that to make pot odds calculations. Very important is whether the flop is dry or wet. Remember that a wet flop means it has a lot of straight and flush possibilities. A dry flop is one like, Jack, 7, deuce, where they're all different suits, so you're not really worried about being up against any draws. And then what you want to look at is how well does the action that happened pre-flop connect with the flop. So for example, if you had a lot of action pre-flop, let's say there was a bet and a raise and a re-raise and a call, and the flop comes 3-3-6, it's very likely that those people weren't raising with those cards, right? So the pre-flop action tells you whether or not there's a connection to the flop. After the flop, you can have several things, right? You could have a full house. You could have a really strong hand like 2 pair or set or something like that. Then a little below that, you could have an overpair to the board or top pair. With that kind of a hand, you're no longer trying to build up a pot. Now you're trying to play poker, and you want to try to muscle the pot away or win the pot or maybe get to showdown maybe a little more cheaply. Oh, and one point here is if the board is dry, you can check because you're not so worried that the turn card's going to scare you. But if the board is very wet, then you want to bet it to protect your hand because you do have a decent hand. Then you can have pairs below top pair, and this is where it starts getting really hard to play poker. One of the reasons that I discourage you from playing hands like 7-10, even if you're suited, because more often, or even the suited connectors, more often than hitting a big draw, you're going to actually hit one of your cards. So say you have 7-10 and the board comes king 10-3, and now somebody's betting. It's scary because there's a king out there. And so you don't want to fold incorrectly. You don't want to fold when you have the best hand. You don't want to get bluffed off the hand. But you also don't want someone value betting and then calling them with a worse hand. Drawing hands are something that you can have. And you can also have nothing hands. Nothing hands are ones that are going to only win if you bluff. And so in order to play up against your opponent, you have to consider what the pre-flop action was. What is your opponent like? What was his range pre-flop? Can you rule out suited connectors based on how they played, for example? And how well does this flop connect with the range of your opponent? You should also think about what your opponent's image of you is, because everything that you're doing to assess your opponent should be doing to assess you as well. And the questions you want to ask is, am I probably ahead or probably behind? Okay, probably ahead means you're going to bet for value. Probably behind means you bluff. In either case, if you're not sure, you can check. If I'm ahead, how likely is it that my opponent is drawing? So you have several pieces of information to answer that. 1 is, how did they bet pre-flop? 2 is, what kind of an opponent is it? 3, do they have position? 4, what is their stack size? You look at all of that stuff to try to assess if you think that they're drawing. Now let's say you're behind. Are you drawing? How many outs do you have that would give you a hand better than what you think your opponent would have? And then if you're behind, should you continue in the hand and try a move on them or something like that? And always take your position into account. So let's look at continuation bets. Most players c-bet most of the time. So when I get into the rooms in the next few days with you guys, I expect to see a lot of continuation bets. And it's very important to pay attention to how your opponents play against c-bets. There are players that never believe a continuation bet, and you do hit the flop sometimes. And so if they're not going to believe you, then that's a good thing. But sometimes they're going to raise you when you c-bet, and you're going to have to fold. And so if you're up against a non-believer, you should tend to c-bet less often. So what considerations do you have about whether to c-bet? And remember, you can only c-bet if you were the pre-flop aggressor. Do it more in position, because your opponents will show weakness that they check to you. And then watch out for players that like to check-raise continuation bets. Don't do it when you have multiple players in as often, if at all. OK, so I think this is repetitive. So let's go back to the post-flop strategy now. Harrington likes to play the percentages. He'll say something like, check 70%, check 70% of the time, bet 30% of the time. And he recommends using your second hand to randomize. I suppose that dates the book a little bit. Most people aren't playing with analog watches with second hands. But think of a way to randomize. Maybe you could look at your watch, and if the lowest digit on your watch is odd, OK, you're in that 50%. If it's even, you're in that 50%. Something like that, because you might trick yourself into always calling or always checking and not really following the percentages. And there are many different ways to play. Some are right, some are wrong, but some are always wrong. So there are certain plays that you should never make. And the strategy is going to be a tight, aggressive strategy. So for the strategy, we're going to assume that you have deep stacks, and we're going to take two key factors into account: position and who was the pre-flop aggressor. So there's going to be 4 different combinations of position and who was the aggressor. So you were the aggressor pre-flop, and you're out of position is one of them. You were the aggressor pre-flop, and you're in position. Your opponent was the aggressor, and you're out of position. Your opponent was the aggressor, and you are in position. So we're going to take each of these separately, because you want to play very differently in each of these scenarios. We'll start off where you're the aggressor pre-flop, and you're out of position. So notice in the table here, I have you with a hand over here, and you are out of position because your caller's on the button, and you're the aggressor because he was the caller. We're going to assume that you raised pre-flop, because this lecture is on flop strategy. So for each of them, I'm just going to tell you what happened pre-flop, and then we're going to look at the flop strategy. So you raised 3 big blinds from third position, and only the button called you. So you're the aggressor, and you're going to be out of position. Now, what should his calling range be? The answer is pretty wide, because he called 1 bet on the button, right? If you remember the pre-flop strategy, almost every one of the type of hands that you can play said you should play it on the button, because you're always going to have position. So let's look at this scenario. This is, you might remember a riddle that predicted this scenario. So you have pocket kings, and the flop comes ace 10 4. And remember, you raised pre-flop. And so how many people here think that you should just come out with a bet? And how many people think that you should check? OK, and who would fold? OK, good. Just checking if you're awake. So the strategy is to bet 20% of the time and check 80% of the time. One of the reasons is that when your opponent called, he could have an ace. We don't know if he has an ace. But more important than that is that he's going to think you have an ace, right? Because you raised in early-ish position. And so very often when you do that with an ace. And so even though you had pocket kings, your pocket kings just shrank way down, because if you bet, your opponent's going to think you have an ace and is probably going to fold any weak hands. OK. So let's look at the variations of things that could happen. Let's say that we bet. In 20% of the instances, we bet, and he calls. We want to keep the pot small because we might be behind here, right? We bet and he called, so maybe he does have the ace. And now we're not going to try to value bet anymore because we don't think we have the best hand necessarily. Variation number 2 is that we bet and he raises. At this point, we fold. Okay? We could easily be representing an ace. He's going to raise us. We're just going to hope to get kings in a better spot and just fold. The third variation is that we check and he bets. And I don't recommend folding here for just 1 bet, because very often if you show weakness by checking, an opponent is going to bet and he doesn't have the ace. If you call, then he's going to start worrying that you have the ace if he doesn't have an ace. If he does have an ace with a weak kicker, he's going to worry that you have an ace with a better kicker, and the pot's probably not going to get very big. So in this instance, don't just fold. And the fourth variation is that we check and he checks. And at this point, we're going to assume he doesn't have an ace, because anyone on a board like that with straights and flush draws, straight draw and a flush draws, is probably not going to check once you've checked. And so we're pretty safe to bet the turn. You could check the turn too. We're not looking to build a big pot here because that ace is out there though. And again, we don't think we're going to get a call from a worse hand if we bet. So very often at that point, it'll just go check, 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 and that'll be the end of the hand. Now, let's look at another variation. Same thing, you're the pre-flop aggressor, and you get a call on the button, but this time the flop comes 8, 9, 10. So here the strategy is to bet 60% of the time and check 40% of the time. One of the reasons we want to bet here, there are a lot of hands that could have called you pre-flop that would be crushing you. For example, if you're looking at somebody's button range, there's a lot of hands like 8, 9, 10, like 8, 9, 9, 10, 8, 10 could all be in the range. And there's a lot of draws there. They could have clubs, they could have a jack, they could have a 7. All of those are pretty big draws. And you want to bet pretty big here because you're concerned that he might be on one of those draws and you have the best hand, and so you charge him. So right now, if we consider the pre-flop action we talked about, there would be 7.5 big blinds in the pot. So you should bet around 6 or 7 big blinds, which is pretty much a pot-sized bet. So let's look at the different scenarios. Say that we bet and he calls. So at this point, we're kind of done with the hand. If he's calling us on that board, we're worried that our one pair is no good. At that point, there's also 21.5 big blinds if we had bet 7 big blinds and he called us. And so do we really want to, the next couple of bets are going to start getting most of our stack in there with just a pair on a very wet board. Also, we're out of position, and that means that we're going to have to show weakness if we're going to be checking, and he could probably take it away from us. Next variation, and this hand right here, I think really gives me a feel for how important position is. Because if I have position, then the other guy gets to act first, and I can respond to it. But by having to act first, if I bet and they call, I'm going to feel really bad on the turn. So let's say we check and he bets. You should call most of the time, and every once in a while fold here on this board, but not too often. It's really hard to fold an overpair, but sometimes you need to do it because if you have, for example, if you have a really tight opponent, they could just have you beat here, and you've only put in 7 big blinds on the flop. You don't want to start messing around with 30, 40 big blinds. Also, there are a lot of scary turn cards that could really get you in trouble. Okay, let's look at a different hand. So now, same situation. You were the pre-flop aggressor, and you're out of position, but you have ace, queen of hearts, and the flop comes like this. That's a pretty good flop. We should be feeling good about ourselves. So we think we're ahead. We're going to value bet. And the reason we're not going to bet every time is to keep our range balanced. So mix in a few checks. Now, the other thing is, if you had a lot of players in the hand, or even 3 players in the hand, you never check here. You always need to bet this for value. And the reason you might check too is to induce a bluff from your opponent. It's not a good enough hand to check raise with, but it's definitely a good enough hand to value bet with. So variation 1, we bet and he raises. Don't re-raise them, but you probably are going to make a call. Then we bet and he calls. And one of the things to think about is if the person calls, we only have a pair hand. Let's try to keep the pot manageable and small. So we're going to check a future street. Okay, same hand, variation 3. We check and he bets. And at that point, we have to call. We don't have a strong enough hand to raise. And we have too strong a hand to fold. And then if we check and he checks, then we know we're good and we can bet on the next street. Okay, this is the hand where we have ace-queen and we flop a queen high. Both are examples of top pair, top kicker. Not top pair, good kicker. So when we had ace-queen and we hit the ace, we have a pair of aces with a good kicker. Now we have top pair, top kicker. So this is a great flop, and if we continuation bet, it could look like we're continuation betting with nothing. And we have a really good kicker. What we really hope to be up against is like king-queen or something like that. So let's say that we bet and he raises. There are too many hands that he could do that with that we're beating, so I wouldn't fold. He's ahead with queens, jacks, sevens, and queen jack, and ace, ace, king, king are beating us. But there are a lot of other hands like king, queen that we like. Okay, this can get a little tedious. So I'm actually going to move through this example to get to the next one. And I knew that at this point everybody would be struggling to keep their eyes open. So I picked perhaps one of the most dramatic hands in the history of the World Series of Poker. This is a 2010 World Series main event, $10,000 buy-in. Final table. I think they're down to 8 players at this point. Whoops, don't look. One of the things to keep in mind is at this point in the main event, the pay jumps are 7 figures. Like the difference between first and second place is often from 10 million to 5 million, and then you go down to 4 million, 3 million, et cetera. So getting knocked out is you just lost millions of dollars. And if there's a short stack at the table, it's even more dramatic. Just wanted to add to the drama here. Okay, so we're going to go back to detailed hand analysis after that excitement. But the next thing I also did is we're going to go through this example, and then after we do, I think pre-flop aggressor in position, I have another one for you that was super good. So hold on to that. Okay, so let's say that, again, you're the pre-flop aggressor, and you have a caller on the button, so you're going to be out of position, and you have tens. And one of the ways to make this more interesting, too, is put yourself in this position and think about, right now you might have come into this class not knowing what you would do in this position, and so here's a strategy for you. So you have a pair of tens, and the flop comes ace, 9, 3. And the strategy is to bet it 80% of the time and check it 20% of the time. The analysis is kind of similar to having kings, which is if he has an ace, you're losing, but otherwise you're probably ahead. And there's a saying, the first one in the pot wins. So if you bet, you might take it down. And with the case of tens, it's not as strong as the kings, because with the tens, you might see another card that you don't like on the turn, and then you're not going to know what to do if a king or queen or a jack comes. So you really want to bet here a lot more often. And you also want to bet on the larger size. So let's look at the various scenarios. Variation 1, you bet and he raises. You're done, right? He may have that ace. Your tens aren't that good. You bet and he calls. Now he's representing an ace, but maybe a weak kicker because he didn't raise you. And there are no draws on this flop, so he's not going to call you because he has a flush draw or a straight draw. So really what you're going to do is slow down at this point. So check on the turn and don't get too involved. Okay, here's another example. This one's a little more happy. You have tens and the flop comes ace, 10, 9. And that's a really, really good result, obviously. You hit a set. But it's even better than just hitting a set because you're hoping that he has an ace. He called you pre-flop. Very often when they do that, they have an ace. And if he has an ace, you're going to get a lot of money in this hand. So you want to make sure that you don't just check here if you're a c-better. If you're someone that's often continuation betting, and then all of a sudden a flop comes like this and you check it, it's going to set off alarm bells for your opponent. Okay, so variation 1, we bet and he raises. Okay, everybody should be feeling warm inside. This is exactly what you're hoping for. 20% of the time you re-raise them, right? There's only one hand that you're losing to. And also remember, pre-flop he just called you, so he probably doesn't even have that hand. And 80% of the time call. And the reason that you want to call is you don't want to scare him off. You've got him on the hook, and you want to keep the money coming into the pot. Okay, so more often you're going to re-raise if there's a bigger draw. So let's say that 9 on the board was the 9 of hearts. Then I would be more inclined to re-raise. Okay, let's say we bet and he calls. Then he may have an ace, or maybe he has a jack-queen or a king-queen or some kind of an inside straight draw. Or maybe he has jack-queen, which is an open-ended straight draw. And so we'll be a little cautious if we get one of the face cards on the turn. The turn is blank, we would bet 50% of the time and check 50% of the time. So let's say we check and he bets. Then we raise 40% of the time and we call 60% of the time. Obviously, you're not going to memorize this entire strategy, but it's to get a feel for should you be raising or should you be calling or checking. And the last variation is that you both check, and you're probably not going to get any money in this hand because he probably doesn't have anything. And so maybe just check and hope that he bluffs at some point. Okay, got another interesting hand for you. So this was a hand that I was watching. This is 2 years ago, the World Series of Poker main event. And I happened to be watching it live when it happened, and I saw this hand, which is kind of cool because you guys are all primed now that this is going to be some crazy hand, but I didn't know it at the time. And the main event, the levels are 2 hours long before the blinds go up. This is the very, very first blind level in the World Series of Poker. The two important players in this hand are Vanessa Selbst. She is an absolute poker celebrity. She's run 3 bracelets, and she's the only woman to win 3 bracelets. She's won $11.8 million in live tournament earnings, but she's considered just a cash king or queen. She won so much money in the cash games, and that's kind of what she's famous for. She has a law degree from Yale. She's a Fulbright scholar. She did her undergrad at Yale. She was up against Gail Bowman, who's also no slouch. She's cashed 14 times at the World Series, has won almost $700,000, and has 2 master's degrees. So this is the first day of the main event, $10,000 buy-in. Right? It's an 8-day event. You play for 8 days, and we're halfway through the first level. And a lot of people would think that Vanessa Selbst is one of the favorites to win the whole thing. And there are other pros at the table. If you play the main event, you usually end up with a lot of random people and not necessarily pros. And this table had not only these 2 players, but a couple of other pros. So let me show you what happened. Okay, so one of the things to think about, we're not done with this hand, it gets really interesting, is that she looked at her cards to see what the suits were. And she knows she has aces, so the question is, why is she doing that? And she's trying to figure out if her opponent could have ace-7, because if her opponent could have ace-7, then maybe she can call, right? Because ace-7 would be a hand that she's beating. And she's going through her mind, what hands would have just gone all in that I could beat, right? And she's trying to think if it's ace-7, then she can beat ace-7. So she's looking at her aces to see what suits they are to somehow help her decide if she could have ace-7 or not. But it's really just a horrible, horrible spot to be in. Let's see what she did. Well, she said at the end, now I've got a story, and she really does. So that was an incredible hand to be watching. Somebody so talented going out like that. And just think about if she really did almost fold, how incredible it would have been on TV if she had folded. The other thing I should mention is I said it was unusual to have so many top pros at a table. But actually, now that I think about it, they were at the TV table. So what the tournament organizers do after everybody's randomly assigned to seats is they take the tables that have the most famous people on them and they move them to the TV table. And so that's why we ended up with all those players there. Okay, so let's continue on looking at flop strategy. So you're the aggressor pre-flop, and now you're in position. And this is a better spot to be in. So the assumptions are that you raised 3 big blinds from the cutoff right before the button, and only the big blind calls. And you're going to act last on every street, so that's a big benefit here for your position. And you can often put your opponent here on a wider range than usual because a lot of people defend their big blinds. Part of their thinking is they've already got 1 big blind in and you raise 3. So now there's 4 big blinds in there and it only costs them 2 to call. But in cash games, I don't think that that's a good strategy. That's a good strategy for tournaments to defend your blind because the blinds matter more. But nonetheless, a lot of people do it. He can also put you on a wide range because you raised in late position in an unopened pot pre-flop. And so you're putting each other on wider ranges here. So let's say in the spirit of the last hand that we saw, you have aces and the flop comes ace-8-5. And the question is, what should your strategy be? So we could generalize this to what should your strategy be when you flop the world, right? Top set, and there's really almost no draws here. So first thing is, keep that. Did you see how Gail had that poker face? So don't do your little dance. Just keep your face kind of fixed. And Harrington recommends that you only raise 10% of the time if he bets 3 big blinds. The board has no draw. You've got the nuts. Basically, you don't really want to show the strength of your hand. And the other thing is, what could your opponent have here? Very little. So let's say he checks. You should bet 25% of the time, check 75% of the time. OK, I'm going to move through these a little faster. So if he checks, you bet. He calls, then raise if he bets, bet if he checks. Now you want to start getting some money into the pot. So obviously he's got something. Hopefully he's got a set lower than yours. And you don't really want to slow play at this point because you want to go for stacks if you can. All right, moving right along. So let's say you have aces and you get this flop. I'm actually curious, are you happy? Who's happy? Who's not happy? OK. So he bets 3 big blinds, and you should mostly just call that. And the reason is this is a very difficult flop, as many of you noticed. The board has all kinds of draws in it. He may already have 2 pair. Very often people play with 2 paint cards like that in that spot. And now, even if you hit your ace, then that's going to put 4 to a straight out there. And so you're going to have 3 of a kind, but anybody with a 10 is going to have a straight. So, and then if you hit your 10, you're probably not going to get paid because he might put you on an ace and figure that you have a straight. So this isn't that great. If he checks, you should bet, but you're not going to get too excited about it. You do want to bet larger than usual because he might have spades and he might have a draw, and so you need to charge that draw. All right. So I think these slides were a lot more interesting to me when I prepared them than I feel they are right now when I'm presenting them. So I'm going to move ahead a little bit. I've got a lot more material to cover. So these slides, by the way, will be available. So if you want to work through these examples, all the text is written there. I'm just going to move ahead. I think you guys will enjoy this hand, though. And I want to give a little bit of preview for this hand. So we've seen Daniel Negreanu before, and I told you that he's a whiz at reading people's hands. And I also told you that he's really good at the table talk, whereas most people maybe do it wrong. Watch him in this hand. His table talk, he's intentionally reading the guy's hand wrong, so the guy will think that that's what he thinks that he has. So he's playing another level. And if you listen carefully, at the very end, you'll see that he actually calls the guy's hand exactly right, which is super cool. And this one's different in several ways from the hands that I've shown you. Now, I did censor this one by blocking out the end result. But as we saw the last time, the end result just pops up there on the screen as the initial picture. So I'm going to ask everyone to look away from the screens. I don't want to ruin this for you. And just wait till I get it started. All right. So, I mean, this is what happens when you play against a top pro. I mean, he just completely destroyed him on that hand. All right. So I'm going to continue to skip through all of these because I think it's more interesting and educational for me to go through what I have after this. I assume that you guys are Hopkins kids, that as I'm going through this quickly, you're getting it all. All right, wasn't this fun? I spent like a whole week making these. All right, so let's summarize everything that we just covered. So we're going to consider who the pre-flop aggressor when we're doing our flop assessment. And that position is very important. And we're going to use these 2 factors to put our opponent on a range. And we need to mix up our play a little bit, but mostly make the standard plays. And the thing is, don't bet if there's no value in betting. And don't bluff if you don't think a better hand will fold. Post-flop is a lot more complicated than pre-flop, and it's a lot more complicated than I've presented to you because we didn't look at multi-way pots where we have multiple opponents, and it's a little different there, and there's just no time in a 2-week course to get into multi-way flop strategy. Different players can have different stack sizes. In all the examples I went through and didn't go through, it was 150 big blinds for our opponent. And then you can have different types of players who are all leveling each other. So we just looked at some very simple action pre-flop, a bet and a call, And obviously, you could have 3 bets, and we only looked at these stack sizes. So I put together some hands now so we can go through some problems and practice what we just talked about with respect to flop strategy. OK, so let's study the table. We have middle position, and we're playing 5-10. We've got 5 players at 1,000 or higher, and the others have between 500 and 1,000. So the table is deep enough to play deep stack poker, and we're dealt queens, but we have some more information. Player F is steaming, which means player F just lost a big hand when he was way ahead. He got a bad beat, and now he's all red in the face. And I can tell you that when you play a lot of poker, you will notice when a player is steaming. And the typical reaction for someone that's steaming is they want to try to win it all back right away. And even really good players will steam sometimes. And so we'll label him in our mind as being a steaming player. And so A and B fold, and now it comes up to us. We're in seat C with $1,050 with our queens. Do we check or raise? Yes?
I think you should raise here.
Should raise. Any disagreement? Yeah. Standard play, you have to raise. You don't. Remember we looked at that mistake before where you let 6 people in with queens. So queens is a strong hand, and you don't want any raggedy aces or kings to get in cheap. You don't want to be up against king 7 and then have a king come and your queens got broken up by that. And you want to kind of raise on the higher end to get those really kind of weak hands out of there. And you're also in sort of early position, and so you're not going to be in position for the hand. So you really want to kind of just try to maybe end this or get up against one opponent. If an ace or king come on the flop, you're going to have to proceed with caution. So you raise to 35, and then players D and E will fold. Player F, your steamer, he's going to call. And G and the blinds will fold. So now your head's up out of position, and the pot is $85. And then the flop comes king, queen, 6. OK, so you are allowed to do a dance, but you have to do it inside your head. You can't show any emotion. And after you do your little dance, you have to decide what to do, bet or check. So how many people would bet? How many people would check? The checks have it. So consideration is we hope he has a king or a queen. And in general, you don't want to slow play flops with lots of draws on them. Okay, so those of you that said bet were probably thinking there are 2 hearts out there, there are 2 Broadway cards, there could be straights, there could be flushes. And you don't want to slow play flops where you're likely to get action because you're up against the steamer. And you want to slow play more against weak players, but in this case you're up against the steamer. You don't slow play them, so you're going to bet. So you bet 45. And now player F raises you to 150. So now what do we do? OK, so when we get raised like that, we have 3 options. We can call, we can fold, or we can re-raise. Who likes a call? Who likes a fold? Who likes a re-raise? OK, now I'm going to ask who likes a re-raise, but I'm going to ask you to tell us why. So only if you want to answer that, raise your hand. Who likes a re-raise? Yes?
So the only hand that really has you beat is pocket kings, and he probably would have re-raised on the pre-flop if he has that. So, and he's also steaming, so you might be able to get a little more money out of him if you re-raise.
Yeah, those are all really, really good reasons. And I like the fact that you looked at the pre-flop action to assign a range, and so you're like, well, he probably doesn't have kings. So you are pretty sure you're ahead, and you always want to get money when you're ahead. And then the question is, do you want to consider the fact that you might scare them off if you re-raise, where you might get more money from them later on? And so not all of the factors are going to point you in the same direction. Some factors may be leaning towards a call, and some might be leaning towards a raise. So let's look at the considerations that I put down. You also should look at the stack sizes. That's really important. So after he bet, he has 465 left, and there's 280 in the pot. And so you're thinking one more bet, and he's completely pot committed, right? So if you can get another bet out of him, then you're going to get his whole stack. And so your choice really is to raise all in or call. You're not going to do like a 3x raise, because when he makes it 150 and he has 465, your only choice there is all in. Now, you know that if he has anything, he's probably going to call your bet because he's steaming. And if he has nothing, he might fire again on the turn. So a consideration for not raising is that you get him to bluff at you again later. But the turn in the river could bring in draws, like a 3 of hearts or a 10 or something like that. And the two things that those draws could do that are bad for you is, one is it could complete his hand if he's got that draw, and two is it could scare you into thinking maybe that he has that draw and that he just beat you. And also you're out of position. You always want to try to end the hand. So the best way to get the money in good right now is to shove it in here. But if I had position, I might call. And the reason is, if I have position, it gives him a chance to bluff at it on the turn. And also, if he checks a turn, then I can still bet. So your decision here would be very different in position or out of position. Okay, so you shove it all in, and he calls you and turns over king, queen. The turn is an 8, the river is a deuce, and you win his whole stack. So let's look at this now from the perspective of what might have happened and how you played it and what could have happened. So let's look at it now from his perspective, right? So he's got king, queen, and he started the hand with 65 big blinds and lost his whole stack. Is that unreasonable? I don't think so. He flopped top 2 pair. And so when you have 65 big blinds and you flop top 2 pair, you can lose your whole stack, and you shouldn't feel bad about that. His pre-flop call was okay. Obviously, he's got king, queen. That's a pretty decent hand. His raise on the flop is pretty standard, because just like you saw all those draws out there, so did he. And he has 2 pair. He's got to be worried about the hearts, about the straights. Is a better hand folding than that? Never, right? He's got 2 pair, top 2 pair. So he knows that when he bets, he's not getting a better hand to fold. Is a worse hand calling? Well, maybe. You could have ace-king. If you had ace-king, then you would call, and that could justify his raise. And also chase those draws out. And you also want to give the draws the wrong odds if they do call you. So his call on your shove, it's difficult, but it's standard. He's already put 150 in. He's got top 2 pair. So in a sense, this is what we call being coolered. He got coolered because the hand played itself. Everything he did was fine, and he still lost. Now, let's look at different scenarios. What if he had just called the flop instead of raising you? On this run out, he would still go broke, right? Because when that 8 of diamonds comes, he's not scared at all by it. And if he was good on the flop, he's still good on the turn. And so he's still going to go broke. But what if a heart had come on the turn? It's possible that if he had just called the flop and a heart had come on the turn, everybody would have slowed down. Each would be worried the other had the flush. And so maybe he doesn't go broke. But as it is, everybody played it properly. Okay, let's look at another hand, one more hand. So you have ace-10, and we're going to look at this $3, $6 game. And you're starting out over here with a little more than 100 big blinds, and you've got some pretty big stacks here. 960 is 300 big blinds, and really only one short stack. And ace-10 is a good hand. It's a decent hand. Your position is the big blind, so probably you're going to be out of position for most of the hand. So those are all the things. I haven't even shown you anything in the hand yet, and still I'm doing a lot of reasoning. And that's what I want you to do when your cards show up, is look at what are the stacks, what position am I in, how strong is my hand, how do my opponents play. And I didn't even mention that we know that player D is tight, and that's something that maybe will come into consideration. So player A folds and player B calls for $6, and player C folds, D calls $6, E, F, and G fold. The small blind calls $3, and there's $24 now in the pot, and you get what's called the option. When you're the big blind, you have the option to just check or raise there. How many people would check? How many people would raise? Okay, well, let's look at what our considerations are. So we had 2 early position limpers. What kind of range do we put them on? Well, we assume the first player maybe isn't a very good player, because you shouldn't be doing that. The second one saw a limper. I have no problem calling with a very wide range there. So now we've kind of got ranges on those guys. The small blind got a good price, right? It only cost him $3, and there are already 2 people in. So he could really have just about any 2 cards. I might even call in that spot with 4-6 of hearts. You know, I don't like having that hand out of position, but if I'm getting such good odds with all these limpers in there, I might call. And then ace-10 is good, but it's not great. We also know that we're going to be out of position, and ace is a medium strength hand. We have decent implied odds because we can make straights and flushes, but we don't really want to build up a huge pot right now with that hand because it's a medium strength. So the better play, according to Harrington, is just to check here. It's really counterintuitive because not everything that I said there argues towards a check, right? The fact that you're going to be out of position after the flop argues for a raise. I think that you can play this hand either way, and I wouldn't fault you for raising it. The raise will chase out the riffraff, and this is a point that I need to be reminded of, and it's a good thing to think about. If you are up against, remember that player B is kind of weak and he limped. A lot of weak players will limp in with a hand like ace-6, and so if you raise, you're going to chase them out, and you love being in there with hands that you dominate. So you will be out of position, so a raise would end it here, and it will have fewer players on the flop. So really, neither play is wrong. I would probably check here maybe 70% of the time and raise 30% of the time. So let's say that you raise to 40, and player B folds, and player D calls 34 more, and the small blind folds. So now we're heads up, and we got $92 in the pot. And you're the first to act after the flop. And here's our flop. So now what would you do? Check or bet? Remember, the theme today is flop play. Check? Bet? OK, let's see what our consideration is. What is his range? So remember, he's the guy that just called a limper. So he just limped behind a limper. So let's look at the different possible hands that he has. In group 1, we'll say high pairs. And we don't think that's likely because he just limped pre-flop. He would have raised. In group 2, we're going to say medium to low pairs. This is very consistent. He limped to see a cheap flop and called your raise. And group 3 are just 2 high cards. And that's not consistent for a tight player. So most likely, when we raised pre-flop, he would have just folded. So we can't assume that all of your opponents are always paying attention, but we know that he's a tight player. And so, so we think that, you know, does he have two high cards? Probably not. So another group is suited connector type hands, and those wouldn't have called a raise, but we can't rule them out because maybe he connected with that flop. OK, the flop is draw heavy, and we've got top pair, top kicker, and mostly we're saying he's holding a small to medium pair. If he has a set, we're obviously going to lose some money. And our hand is good, and it's not likely to improve. So these are all the considerations that we want to go through in making our decision. And finally, we are out of position. So I would say here that you want to bet, and you bet $70, and the player folds, and you win. So when you have top pair, top kicker out of position, which is going to happen to you pretty often, keep in mind that you're not looking to build a big pot. It's a good idea here and there to check one of the streets. Maybe you check the turn, maybe you're going to check the river. If you bet every single street, you're going to build way too big a pot for what you have. On dry boards, you want to check more often because you're not worried about getting beaten by a draw, and on wet boards, you want to bet. And finally, position is really a big factor here. OK, so that's all I have for today. Remember, if you're interested, 7:30 tonight and 8 o'clock tournament tomorrow. I'll see you guys on Tuesday. Have a good holiday weekend.